morning, everyone. Appreciate you coming out for the first session. I want to let everyone know, unfortunately, Trust Africa, who you see here listed on the program, was not able to make it. But we do have two other great speakers. We each represent three different types of institutions working on accountability in very different ways. And that is what this session is on, accountability and governance in Africa. And I think before going any further, I have to say it's a very exciting time to be working on those issues in Africa. And I think that particularly relates to the issue of presidential term limits. We have seen last year in Burkina Faso, the incumbent president failed to extend presidential term limits. And then earlier this year in Burundi, the president succeeded, but faced massive protests. And there are several other countries in 2016 and 2017 where this looks to be an issue as well. And I think the way that that plays out will play a very important role in seeing if Africa does turn a new page when it comes to accountability. So my name is Brooks Marmon. I am a program officer with a small grassroots NGO operating in Liberia, also a few countries in Southeast Asia as well, working to promote accountability. And as you now see behind you, the names of my two fellow panelists. So Celso, maybe you could say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Well, I'm Celso from Mozambique, Portuguese-speaking country, actually. And back home, I teach at High Institute of Public Administration, and I'm affiliated to Celso Monjane University. But now I'm based in Denmark at Roskilde University. Yeah, basic thing.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Katherine Hudak, and I work for the African Development Bank. I work in the Strategy and Policy Department as a consultant. Before that, I worked for a small economic development consulting firm in South Africa, where we worked with government institutions. We worked for the Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Transport in South Africa, the World Bank, and also private companies. So thank you for having me.
Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm going to show a few slides, talk about my work with the Accountability Lab in Liberia, how we promote accountability among youth there. Then we'll have a brief discussion with the other panelists about their work to promote accountability in, I would say, very different ways from what I am doing. And then we'll conclude with the brief examination of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance and the way that this very interesting tool also contributes to that discussion. So why are we called the Accountability Lab? Why do we focus on accountability? Well, we see development as a governance challenge. We see accountability really as being at the root cause of underdevelopment. Other interventions may treat the symptoms of underdevelopment, but are not getting at the core problem. Certainly living in Liberia, it's a country that has extremely poor infrastructure, but at least in the capital, that is not for want of various projects. Many infrastructural development projects take place, but if you look at the accountability issue in terms of procurement, in terms of bidding, corruption, money being siphoned off along the way, you have roads being built, bridges being constructed, but they don't last. So we think focusing on accountability is the way to get it right, to have sustainable development. So how do we do that? I think our model is very different from the two speakers that you will be hearing after myself. Basically, we are innovative, but we innovate with simplicity. And we're working with youth, so of course we have to keep it fun. So what are some ways that we do this? Well, first, listen, understand the context. So often in development, in governance programs, people are time-bound, they have quick impact projects, or at the longest, it's a 3 or 5 year cycle, often. So we talk to people, we get to know people, we try to look at people with backgrounds that the typical development organizations might not reach to. So in this picture, you see a gentleman. His name is Alfred Sirleaf. He has a chalkboard on which he is writing the news. He's writing it in simple Liberian English. He uses pictures. He uses images. And he's widely read. Usually you'll see people, market women with trays of fish on their heads, standing, reading, and it reaches a lot of people. So you often hear about high tech, but here he is doing something very low tech. So related to that, we think it's also very important to meet people where they are, not necessarily where you want them to be. Of course, you may be pushing in that direction. Here you see students at an accountability film school offered by one of our partners, the Liberia Film Institute. And this has been a very interesting case of organizations often being very prescriptive. So there has been a lot of interest in our work with film. It resonated with donors, but the product, it's very much geared towards the local tastes, similar to Nollywood styles. So often the donors didn't quite get what we were doing. But when Ebola came, when there was a crisis, when people wanted to reach Liberians in a way that they understood, the donors did come to us. So it was very rewarding to see that happen. So we always say we like to name and fame rather than name and shame. So when you hear the word accountability, I think particularly if you're an African lawmaker, many times they get nervous, they get uneasy, and we are a small organization, limited resources, limited reach. So we find it much more beneficial to actually work with the government in a collaborative way so that we're still promoting accountability, but we're framing the discussion in a way that is really agreeable to all. So as part of that process in Liberia, we work with the government on the Open Government Partnership. And as I mentioned, our primary target audience is youth. So if you want to reach youth, and as we all know, the demographics in Africa, in the Middle East, overwhelmingly young. I think 70% of Liberians are under the age of 35. Well, there's no better way to reach youth than through popular culture. So you see Integrity Idol Liberia. That's currently a program that we have underway. It's a reality TV show. We had a process which we've now identified 5 finalists, teachers, court clerks, caretakers of government buildings, and we're going to be having an open voting process following the airing of each episode in which the top performing civil servant can be identified. So certainly talking about civil servants on their own, writing a report about it, that might not resonate with youth, but when you do it in a TV show, when people can vote, when they can have a voice, it really creates an exciting conversation. And another area that we work with, in which I think we're making a tremendous impact, is in music, particularly with Liberian rap music, which there is known as hip-co. So we just filmed our first music video, which has been a great success. Lots of people talking about it. We've done a premiere. We've helped the artists do several performances. We support a weekly open mic night with music, with spoken word, with comedy. So wrapping my remarks up, as we go about doing this, it's very important that we build an ecosystem for accountability. Liberia is a country of 4 million people. There are literally thousands of NGOs. So what you're doing, probably someone else is doing something similar. We work very closely with the Center for Transparency and Accountability in Liberia. We support, I would say, about 10 projects that are implemented by people, local people in their communities. We bring them together on a quarterly basis where they have discussions, where they're able to share ideas. When we're doing a music video launch at the University of Liberia, we make sure to bring in a student group that we have working on advocacy issues in tertiary education to come and speak. So we try to create a conducive environment to really push this along, which I think allows me to move into how is this done at a much larger institution. We are quite small. We are grassroots. So, Katherine, working at the African Development Bank, maybe you could let us know how the bank supports governance and accountability throughout the continent.
So the African Development Bank right now sees governance and accountability as one of its core things that it wants to focus on going forward. It believes that transparent, accountable, and efficient governance systems are key to sustainable and inclusive economic growth. So we don't focus really on political governance, we're more on the economic side. So most of our policy dialogue focuses on macroeconomic policies, efficient revenue mobilization, such as collecting taxes, public financial management, and then robust sector management, especially in the extractives and infrastructure industries.
I know you're in the policy and strategy department. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the results, the successes, the achievements that the bank has had in the governance and accountability sphere?
Sure, but first I'd like to go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's really where we're looking to align ourselves, and I think most international development institutions are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, which were discussed in September in New York. There was a big conference with all the heads of the development institutions to basically say, okay, we all agree on these 17 goals, and we're going to work towards these. So for us, we're looking at 16 and 17. SDG 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions, and 17 is about creating efficient partnerships. So us at the bank, we have created our 10-year strategy, which guides all of our projects, all of our work, and really is the key defining factor for the bank going forward. One of our operational priorities is actually on governance and accountability, and relating to that, we have the Governance Strategic Framework and Action Plan, also known as GAP2. And then our new president, President Adesina has just listed 5 of his, they're calling them the high 5 goals, and one is improving the quality of life of Africans, so that is also related to that. So in terms of our 10-year strategy, we're really focusing on supporting institutions and projects that support inclusion and promote accountability, particularly supporting the development of states founded on effective institutions, good governance and regulation for economic growth. We're also looking at improving public financial management in the areas of fiscal decentralization and also resource mobilization. So as I said, like collecting taxes efficiently and effectively. So our GAP 2 focuses on 3 key pillars. One is public sector and economic management. One is sector governance, particularly in the extractives and infrastructure industries. And then the third is focusing on investment climate and business enabling environment. So this looks at job creation and just making sure that countries have the right policies and institutions in place so that the private sector can develop. So back to your first question about our results. Well, actually, over 2011 and 2012, 2008 to 2011, we spent 22% of our resources on governance initiatives. In the 14 countries that we were working with, in terms of increasing their revenue systems, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP increased from 10.5% to 14.7%. So we were quite successful there. And similarly, for the tax rates for the businesses, they actually decreased from 93% of profits to 54% of profits. So while we were increasing revenue for countries, we were also decreasing tax rates for individual businesses. So we were really putting in place effective ways to collect taxes and also making sure that businesses weren't being stretched too far. Similarly, we had 20 countries that had improved quality of budgetary and financial management, and 23 countries improved their transparency, accountability, and corruption mitigation in the public sector, among other things.
Thank you. So shifting from results to policy, and certainly as someone who is based on the Ivory Coast, I'm very curious for your thoughts on is it possible for states to develop without strong democratic systems, without accountability? Certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, we hear much about the Singapore model. And I think historically, there could be an argument that within Africa, where you are, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, might have for some time been the closest to that with a long-serving benevolent dictator, Felix Houphouët-Boigny. So maybe moving away from the official bank position to your thoughts on that issue.
So that's quite an interesting question, Brooks. And it is true that Cote d'Ivoire, for the longest time, had the best infrastructure system, we could say best infrastructure system in West Africa. The roads are great, we have lots of bridges, air connectivity is okay, electricity, water, we have pretty good schools. So it is true that we have a lot of great infrastructure, which came about during that period of time. And still is working today. For example, I've only seen one small blackout in the entire time I've been in Cote d'Ivoire. In South Africa and Nigeria, where I was previously, that was much, much more frequent. So it is true that you can have infrastructure development, but I can say that it's not sustainable. So Cote d'Ivoire was really poised to develop quickly and develop really well. However, over the last 2 decades, we've seen a war. We've seen in 2011 a political crisis that left many people dead and really damaged the economy. And Cote d'Ivoire is still struggling to kind of bounce back from that. So I think you can have development without accountability, but it's not sustainable. So unfortunately for Côte d'Ivoire, I think it's really quite far behind other countries. Like if you look at Kenya, if you look at even where Tanzania is right now, Côte d'Ivoire really should have been in a leading position if you look at the infrastructure it has, but unfortunately it's not right now. It's trying, but it's not where it should have been.
Well, I think that then brings us to the current situation in Côte d'Ivoire. There has been an election there just week and a half ago. The country has been experiencing rapid growth. When we turn to the Ibrahim Index later on, it's been making vast strides up the index. So what is the latest from the ground in the post-election scenario?
So the election was quite calm. We had a few small demonstrations, mostly by the FPI, which was the former president's party, and the National Coalition for Change. There were a few gatherings prior to the elections. There was a little bit of sort of conflict between the police and them, but nothing really major. And most of the issues were around how the election proceedings were taking place, like how you could campaign, how registration was happening, things like that. So it was really quite calm. I can say that campaigning was cut quite short. You could only campaign from the 9th through the 24th. I can't say why they had such a short period of time for campaigning. I don't know if it was to, so it wouldn't prolong some of the gatherings or something like that, but we really didn't even see posters until about mid-October. So in terms of the voting, they did the voting on the 25th, and the results were released quite soon after the preliminary and then the final results. So the current president, Alassane Ouattara, won his second term by 84% of the vote. The person who was running for the FPI party, which was the former president's party, he received 9% of the vote, and then the other candidates received the rest. There were 8 other candidates, although 3 pulled out right before the election actually took place. And we had the UN and then the former president of Senegal, former prime minister of Senegal, Aminata Touré, watching over the elections to make sure they were transparent and people were being held accountable and that the votes were counted correctly. We had 55% of registered voters actually voted in the election, which is down from 80% in 2010. But all in all, they were really, it was a calm election period, and I think people are quite happy with the current president because he's been making a lot of strides, especially economically. We just opened the HKB bridge in Abidjan, which is kind of an engineering feat. It's really helped people move around quickly. It's really well made, and people are quite happy with the changes they're seeing in the capital and around Côte d'Ivoire. So I think that those changes are a testament to his leadership, and people are happy to vote again for him.
Well, we can only hope that the situation remains stable, and I think certainly someone who's working and living in Liberia, stability in Ivory Coast is much needed for the stability of the sub-region, especially as Liberia will get a new head of state in 2017. But shifting attention from West Africa to the southern part of the continent, Celso, you've been waiting very patiently and quietly. So coming from Mozambique, also a country that has a history of civil war, now 25 years removed from that, so further along the path, at least on paper, of consolidating democracy and the dividends of peace. Could you start by maybe telling us a little bit about your work at the Higher Institute of Public Administration and how that institution contributes to good governance and accountability in Mozambique?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, as I said, I teach at High Institute of Public Administration back home, and this institute is a government school of government, which means that we aim to promoting capacity building through training. So we train top public officials, issues like public administration, leadership, and governance in general. So, as you say, there are two main ways we can, improving or promoting improvement of accountability. So we do that by training those leaders in terms of, because you have a specific course on democratic accountability. So we believe that through training, they will be able to know the complexity or the mechanism to account for their actions. Because accountability is not all about addressing on parliament, but as well as providing information to the public about their actions, decision making, and stuff like that. So actually, we do that by training public officials. Yeah, in terms of.
Great. Well, thank you. I know that you are a PhD student, and you're just getting started on your dissertation,
Yep.
which I understand looks at extractive industries in, I guess it would be central Mozambique. So certainly when one talks about doing business in Africa, it's still very much related to extractive industries, large mining corporations. So I'll be very eager to hear your thoughts on this, maybe particularly in the Mozambique context, which you're most familiar with. Are governments holding these corporations accountable? Or do you see a bit of complicity with the two? Or do you feel that African governments even have the strength and the power to be able to effectively negotiate with these corporations?
Yes, thank you. Actually, Mozambique, like some African countries, is very rich in natural resources, like gold, gas, coal, graphite, uranium, a lot of minerals. It's a very rich country. And Mozambique has been receiving a huge natural resource investments. And according to the most recent investment report, more than $4 or $5 billion hauled in 2014 of investment, FDI investments in Mozambique. So most of these investments go to the extractive industry, which is more prominent in African Mozambique specifically. One of the biggest sectors in Mozambique is the coal sector, which have been observed so much investment. But there's some challenge with this sector because one of the biggest problems for an extractive industry in Africa is how to ensure that the country benefits from these FDIs. So it's been a big challenge now. So back to Mozambique, I've been researching on the impact of coal on the country's economy. And there's some basic result I've found so far. Because in the beginning, people would expect that the coal mining would boost the country's economy. But I think now the widespread notion that prospects of development based on coal industry are not reliable anymore. It's not because the price of coal, because commodity price just go up and down every time. It's not because the price of coal, but it's because some domestic political issues I would like to share with you. What it is? Yeah. Yeah, so there's some few slides I'd like to share with you about what's going on in coal industry in Mozambique. So it's important to understand how business are in those countries. It's relevant to look at the political economy of those countries. power relations and stuff like that. So back home in Mozambique, we see like foreign direct investments in Mozambique, and we expect to get some huge revenues, but what's going on the ground is totally different. We see, for example, when those investments come into the country, we see some political factions try to take some shares on that. So there has been a big challenge, how the government will hold those companies accountable if they share some capital interests. So it is being kind of, the line between the capitalists and political elites are quite different, because for one side, the politicals have to define laws, and the other side, they are business people, so it's a kind of a confusion thing. So I think it's undermine accountability, because those companies have to hold to account to the government, and the government have to account to the public. But there's such a confusion because those issues you see on the slides. Yeah.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. When doing some advanced research, reading about the Ibrahim Index, it was very interesting to see the emphasis on regional groupings. How is Southern Africa performing in a specific area, education, rights, accountability in comparison to other regions of the continent? And coming from Mozambique, particularly its recent history, where it was certainly dragged down by its neighbors, white minority governments playing a leading role in starting the civil war that ended almost concurrently with the end of apartheid. So as a political scientist, what are your thoughts on this? Does being in a region such as being surrounded by Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, states that perform well, does that sort of rising tide lift all boats, or is it more complex than that?
Thank you. Before I answer your question, I would like just to remark. It seems that I'm bringing some negative trends of Mozambique, but actually Mozambique is one of the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa. So it doesn't mean that everything is very bad in Mozambique. Yeah, going straight to your question, it's a tricky question because, if you look specifically on accountability in SADC countries, you can see Namibia, South Africa, and Botswana, they have high scores. But if you look at Mozambique and some other countries, they have very low scores. So I think it's not about being part of the same group. It's not like that, because if you see, for example, Namibia has a very high scores. If you look to Angola, their neighboring countries, the scores of accountability are very, very low. If you look to Botswana, the scores of accountability are very high, but if you look to Malawi, are very low. The same with South Africa. South Africa has high scores of accountability. If you look to Mozambique and neighboring countries, they are business partner, but the accountability in Mozambique is relatively low. So I think we should look actually to the political economy of the country, the context of the country, because the political dynamics differ in those countries, even though they are kind of business partners. Yeah.
Certainly, very understandable. So let's use that to seg in and also start to wrap up, as I see we're approaching on 10 o'clock, into a brief examination of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, which also very much positions itself and plays a role in contributing to the larger discussion, that sort of ecosystem of accountability that I referenced previously in my presentation. So the index, it's a product of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Mo Ibrahim is the Sudanese, British mobile telecommunications billionaire, which has allowed him to engage in sort of a trio of interventions to promote good governance on the continent. In addition to the index, there's the much lauded prize for African leaders, which a former Mozambique head of state has received. Perhaps troublingly, a number of years, no leader has been deemed worthy of this prize, although I do believe one was awarded this year, also to a head of state from the region, the president of Namibia. The foundation also offers fellowships for emerging African leaders at 3 different institutions, one of which is the African Development Bank, the other is the UN Economic Commission on Africa in Ethiopia, and then the World Trade Organization in Switzerland. But the index, what is the index? It's something that's published, it's been published every year since 2007, initially focused only on sub-Saharan Africa, now has data for all African nations. I believe it's backdated through 2000, and it is, they say it is, the most comprehensive index of African governance. So here you can see the number of indicators, number of subcategories, 93 indicators, 14 subcategories. We have their definition of governance as well. Accountability falls under the safety and rule of law category. It's a subcategory, and it has 9 of the 25 indicators in that category, and 9 of the 93 total indicators in the index. Now I'm a guy, I'm working with musicians and movie makers. I don't have a whole lot of technical expertise in this field, so Katherine, working at the bank, I know the bank actually provides some of the data that's used for the index. So maybe you could speak a little bit about, to the extent you can, this index, but also in general, how you use these indices in your work, and perhaps some of the challenges and issues of data quality, data integrity.
Thank you, Brooks. So this index, as you said, is the most comprehensive one on African governance, and we do look at it at the bank. We also provide inputs to it along with the World Economic Forum, World Bank, Economist Intelligence Unit, and others. The data comes from many, many different sources. We also, when we do our own development effectiveness review, we look at a variety of indices to see how countries that we're working with have changed. So if they have increased or decreased their ranking on one of these global indices, then we take that as a sign that maybe our budgetary support operation has been effective. So we definitely do kind of a well, not fact checking, but sort of like a check with our own operations using these indices, from my understanding. Some of the challenges, however, with these kind of indices are that there are always going to be margins of error. So especially when you are doing surveys, like the World Economic Forum has a global competitiveness report, and they get a lot of their data from expert surveys. So there's always going to be a margin of error, particularly when you're looking at qualitative data, and you have to look at who's getting the surveys, who's actually filling out the surveys. Is it the person who knows the most, or is it being addressed just to the president, who maybe doesn't have all the knowledge about the particular questions that are being asked, or perhaps maybe someone who's not a technical person is filling out the survey. So there's always going to be some error. However, the IAG actually does account for these errors with in terms of how they record results and interpret the results. So they've done a good job with that. Also, you have to look at the methodology used and the type of data collected. So as I said, is it qualitative, quantitative? Does it come from, is it primary data, or are you using someone else's data and extracting information from that? Also, are you looking at surveys? Who are you sending the surveys to? And when you're using other institutions' indicators, you have to look at what question they're actually asking, and what you have to interpret the results correctly. So there can be some problems, with interpretation. And when you add data on top of data, there can always be issues there. Also, there's a problem with circular reference error. So sometimes we look at World Bank data as kind of a gold standard in our industry. But the World Bank data sometimes uses very, very old base numbers. So I remember working in Nigeria, and we were looking at education enrollment rates, and I think the World Bank at that time was still using a base year of 1998, and then projecting off of that. So over a decade has passed, and they haven't really updated their base year. So you have to be careful about how frequently the data is being updated, and if projections are actually, if they're going back and checking how they're running their projection models. Also, country context is critical for accurate interpretation of the results. So, for example, if a country score decreases on the CPI, which is the Corruption Perception Index, that doesn't necessarily mean there's more corruption in the country. It could mean that it's just being reported better. Maybe there are more efforts being made to publish that data, or to actually hold people accountable and prosecute them. So you have to be careful when you're interpreting the results to really look at the country that's in question. And then, as I mentioned briefly before, there's also the issue of frequency of updates and availability of data. So sometimes when indices can't find the data that they need exactly, they'll use something as a proxy, and they might run a projection off of a piece of data that's not necessarily exactly what they were trying to achieve. So you just have to be careful when you're looking at these indices to make sure that you're using them correctly, and you're also understanding that they're not really, you can't rely solely on the number that comes out from the indicator.
Well, Celso, I think we can give you the last word, and then hopefully we'll be able to conclude relatively on time. I mentioned that it was troubling that the Ibrahim Foundation was unable in some years to find a leader, former head of state, worthy of the African Leadership Prize. You may also remember that I launched my remarks by noting that Accountability Lab, why are we focusing on accountability? Because we believe it's at the crux of development challenges. So then it is even, I would say, more concerning, alarming, that of the 14 subcategories in the index, accountability has the lowest overall score. So Celso, maybe final words, some of your thoughts for why this may be, and also as someone from the Lusophone African world, I found it very interesting to see some of the discrepancies with states that seem to have come from very common historical trajectories, particularly Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you once again. So first look at the accountability. I was wondering how they measure accountability in this index. And I figured out they rely mostly on measures based on corruption. We can see here accountability, transparency, and corruption, corruption in bureaucracy, corruption in government, and stuff like that. They use different measures of corruption to calculate the index of accountability. So if you ask why the accountability is so low, it makes absolute sense. Because if you look the scores of corruption in Africa, we can see that they are very low. Different organizations, International Transparency, and some other organizations, they have scored Africa as being highly corrupt. I don't say I agree with that, I doubt that, but that's what the number says. So if the number says that Africa is highly corrupt, and you use the corruption to calculate accountability index, it makes sense that the accountability index will be extremely low. So it depends how they calculate the index. I think that's why it's the case. But I would like to move forward to Lusophony countries. As I said, I'm a Portuguese speaker. And there are some discrepancies in terms of accountability in those countries, even though they have the same colonial legacy and they share about the same history. But in terms of accountability, it's different. So one may well ask, why is that the case? So if you look, we can see Cabo Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe have relatively high scores when compared to Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. And interesting is that Cabo Verde, which have the high scores, and Guinea-Bissau, which have the lowest scores, they used to be a kind of a union in the beginning when they had their independence in 1974. But years later, they just separated, and they end up building up different institutions. Because if you see Guinea-Bissau, the history of attempts of overturn the government, but we cannot see the same in Cabo Verde. So for me to analyze these discrepancies, I think it's really complex. I try to bring out three main variables. In political science, we look in this way, which depends on the form of government you have, degree of economic dependency, or how power is configured. Even though those countries have the same historical legacy, they have different institutions. We can see the forms of government are quite different. They build up different systems. As we know, theoretically, presidential systems tend to be less accountable when comparing to semi-presidential systems. Could be one of those explanations. If you look at degree of economic independence or dependence, we can see countries with low scores of accountability, most of them, they rely on extractive industry. They are kind of sort of resource state, how they call rentier state, which is they rely more on revenues, or they collect revenues for extractive. They do not tax heavily the citizens. So the citizens do not push much for accountability. It is like that. But other thing we can see, which I think it's more consistent, is to look at the political economy of those countries. If you see in those countries how the power configuration is, we can see that the countries which present the highest scores of accountability, they are more cohesion in terms of different factions, powerful factions within the country. But if you look at all remaining countries, which the scores of accountability is lower, the configuration of power, it's more dispersed, which means that the government have too many powerful factions to accommodate, which is much complicated. So they end up relying on clientelism and stuff like that. So it can undermine accountability. So, and thank you.
Well, thank you as well, Celso. Well, we've covered a fairly large period of ground. I think we're also only a few minutes past 10 o'clock. So I'm not sure how the timing is. I think if we have time to open the floor to questions, we are glad to do so. We're also glad to cede the floor if time is a constraint.
And you talked about coal, but there is something which I believe is interesting about natural gas. Natural gas, the obvious market is South Africa, So they entered an arrangement, if I understand, that there's no transfer of cash. They keep 20%, I believe, in kind to develop their economy. So that it would minimize the question of corruption because there's no money involved. What do you think of this example?
Thank you. I think there are now new gas fields that have been discovered somewhere in Cabo Delgado, but we have some gas that has been exported in Inhambane, which is the province of Inhambane, and we have a deal with South Africa, which we export this gas to South Africa. So actually in Mozambique, we struggle with infrastructure, unfortunately. We have a lot of problems with infrastructure. We don't have too much money to invest because it will be great if you could use our own gas to produce different things, fertilizers, energy, and stuff like that. But we don't have such infrastructure. It's the same. We have like one of the biggest dams in Mozambique. We have to export our energy to South Africa to be transformed, and they send back to us. So it becomes more expensive. So I think the problem will be on infrastructure. But even now we have like huge reserves of gas in somewhere in Cabo Delgado. But the problem is the trend of extractive industry in Mozambique. It's not very positive. So people are kind of skeptical in terms of if the gas extraction follow the same path with the coal, it will be a problem. So it's a sort of thing, but I know that the government is doing efforts to strengthen like institutions and for producing new regulation so that they will benefit from gas sector. But I think for me, the way I see it, the only way they can benefit is to ensure that local firms can supply those commodity sector and probably make sure that they can tax those companies. Yeah. I don't know if I went straight to your question, but that's the way I see it. Thank you.
Oui, ma question s'adresse à Monsieur Monjane. Vous avez parlé de la formation.
Mr. Monjane, he spoke about, in fact, training of leaders and high officials with a view to fighting against corruption. You spoke about training of leaders and high officials with a view to fighting corruption. And what do you think? Do you really think that this can yield results if not accompanied by a legislative system of sanctioning system, and if not accompanied by coaching, by control? And yet another question that is relevant, you spoke about multinationals, as well as results of activities of extracting industries and the impact on the population. In these multinationals, do they have a policy of accountability of the corporation to the development of the local population?
Yes, thank you very much. Looking at the first question related to what we do, we train the public officials. I think this is a part of the story because we do our part and part of training it, but there are some other institutions that have to work along. We train them, but we have to ensure that other institutions work on enforcement and stuff like that. So we just train, and then what we do with the knowledge. So I think there's some other institution will, or different oversight mechanisms to that. So when we go to talk about accountability policies, I will say in Mozambique institutions are in place, but the problem is not the institution itself, it's the enforcement of those institutions. We have regulation, but we have a problem with enforcement with those regulations. So that will be the problem. Because if you see, for example, if you look at the coal mining in Mozambique, in Tete, we see that the communities have been complaining a lot because they believe that their life and conditions of living is getting worse because they're mining. And there's history of land grab and stuff like that. And when they complain, they have a feeling that the government is not doing anything. But why is that the case? Even if the regulation is very clear what those FDIs have to do when they go to a certain community to extract coal. But the problem is not the regulation as such. The regulation is very clear. The problem for me is enforcement of those regulations. I think that is the big challenge now, how to enforce the existing regulation.
Katherine, the second part of the question may also go to your strengths. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you for your question. So I just wanted to add onto your question about whether companies really need to make sure that do they have a responsibility to the community and the country when they are extracting natural resources. And I did some work in West Africa with the World Bank when I was with a consulting firm, and we looked at local procurement of goods in the mining industry. And so this is an area of concern lately because we see a lot of mining communities that don't benefit at all from the extraction of natural resources. So we worked in Liberia and Burkina Faso, for example, in 2011 and 2012, and we worked with mining companies like Anglo American, and we worked with the local governments and national governments to set up a policy framework and also to try to assist the mining companies in actually procuring from local people. Now, part of the problem also is that mining companies need specialized equipment, so there are some things that they really can't take from a country. You can't bring in Caterpillar land movers from Liberia. You have to import that from the US or France. But there are things that governments and international financial institutions like the AFDB and the World Bank are trying to do in terms of supporting the development of SMEs, particularly service providers, looking at the needs of the mining companies so that there can be some value that stays in country, particularly in the local communities, and that not all of the value of the resources is exported. So we're also looking at value addition processes. So not looking at the mining industry, but in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, cocoa is the largest export, and they provide the majority of cocoa in the world. However, we don't do any processing. I've been trying to find locally processed chocolate bars since I got there, and I've only found one small producer. The rest is sold to large multinationals, and they ship it to Europe and the US, and they do their roasting and processing and packaging elsewhere.
So I understand, Katherine, that you're a little bit reserved about the utility of the EBAIM index. And your reservations sound to me a lot like what the reservations that we scientists somehow have about citation indices. Hello? Often the data are incomplete, or the way in which they're gathered is not adequate, and so on. But what we do is we compare those numbers with our own anecdotal impressions or other metrics. And so I was sitting here, listening to you speaking, and I was comparing the evolution of the EBAIM index for Liberia and Côte d'Ivoire with, the sort of political developments that we know about. And so it's interesting that the index for Côte d'Ivoire, for example, has gone up by 8% over the last 4 years. And I think this largely explains why the president got re-elected by an overwhelming majority. So I think it completes the story. The two aspects complete the story. In the case of Liberia, the index has been pretty much static for the last 10 years, but of course it made an enormous jump at the end of the Liberian Civil War. So I think these two aspects are both interesting and important.
I completely agree. We were discussing that last night when we were preparing, actually, that if you look at the 2011 results, which is actually where they start doing, they're looking at 2011 to 2015, how the results change. In 2011 is when we had our political crisis in Côte d'Ivoire. So it really is apparent that right now, when we're in a period of calm and economic development, and there is a bigger push on accountability within Côte d'Ivoire, that we would see such a large jump. So it is important to look at all the factors of the story, and I think it does make sense for Côte d'Ivoire. But more, I think it's important to, when you see small changes, it's important not to put so much weight on a shift of 0.1% or even 1%, because again, the data is also not always reliable. But thank you.
I would like to have a point of view about the role of civil society concerning the control of governance and accountability in Africa, and if African Development Bank do have a policy about that, mainly concerning the implementation of projects. During the implementation of your project in Africa, civil society organizations, do they have a role to play?
I'm not on the operations side, so I can't answer too much about that, but we do view civil society organizations as having a role to play within the development of economies. We also, in terms of when we implement projects, we have many policies that we adhere to make sure that the projects are being implemented in a transparent and accountable way. Funds are accounted for. For example, we have a very long disbursement period, and most of that relates to the fact that we've put in place so many checks and balance systems to make sure that people are, that money is being used in the appropriate way. And the task manager is always traveling back and forth to the site to make sure that that the project is being carried out in a way that adheres to like our GAP 2 governance policy, and also just our policies and views as an organization. But maybe Brooks can elaborate a little bit about the role of civil society in Africa.
On the bank itself, I can't say a lot. We do share an office with a nonprofit business incubator and the Liberia country representative for the bank. He is a frequent visitor. Civil society in Liberia, I think there is a decent amount of collaboration with multinational institutions in general. World Bank comes to mind. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. A number of civil society organizations work with them. So I think there is some collaboration there and ongoing, yet at the same time, I do think there is some unease. Those two groups are not, they don't have the largest natural affinity. I think the languages that they speak are slightly different, although certainly the end goal is the same. But I think the trend for collaboration is gradually and slowly on a positive incline. So I think then we have run out of time. Thank you very much for the time that you gave us, for your questions. Thank you to Sharing Knowledge Foundation for the invitation. Thank you very much.